Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester. Today, I'm joined by Cam Brown from Forsite. Hey, Cam, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for having me here, Kim.
Cool. So we were just talking before we started recording that you had just come back from a vacation. You went coast to coast, East Coast, Newfoundland, all the way over to Tofino. That must have been totally refreshing, out of the woods, a change of scenario or scene, I should say. Yeah.
Great stuff. Spending time with family, and now back in the saddle.
Yeah. So maybe for our listeners, introduce yourself, like where are you based, and maybe tell us how you became a forester. I don't think I actually know the story in all the years we've known each other, so I'm also excited to hear what the connections are. But yeah, maybe introduce yourself and how you became a forester.
Cool. So I'm Cam Brown. I'm located in Salmon Arm, BC, where Forsite's headquarters are. My road to forestry is a bit of a long one. I actually grew up in Southern Ontario. I had no clue what forestry was when I graduated high school. I skied a lot as a kid, and I just took a year off and came out west and skied at Whistler for the year. And while I was out here, forestry started to come into my world, but I decided I wasn't going back to the east, so I went to school at UBC. And I actually found a forestry program halfway through that first year and got into forestry. I've always had a love of kind of math, physics. I've always a bit of the geek side, but I love being outdoors too. And I managed to fill both those two worlds with a forest engineering degree come out of UBC. And then when I finished there, my wife was actually doing a chiropractic degree in Portland, Oregon. So I ended up doing a master's degree in Oregon State, and worked out beautifully. I got basically free tuition, was a TA down there, and did a great program with John Sessions and a whole bunch of other great folks down there, where I learned a lot about heuristics, programming, optimization, really got into the timber supply world. And, then after that, I came back up to BC and did the old work in the bush as a forester for a good 5 years, on the BC coast and here in the BC interior. So, cool. Eventually I got my RPF around 1996, so that kind of dates me.
Well, you still have the boyish look as always. I'm always like, because I know your kids are older than mine, and it's like Cam always looks so young. It's like just like that boyish look there. So very cool. It's kind of interesting you mentioned the technical background, because a lot of folks, when I talk to you, I'm still trying to see if there's this trend. But the digital foresters, if we call them, there always seems to be a lineage back to some point in the forestry career, but a technical background or some influencing force. So it's interesting to hear you kind of say that, you've always come from that side of things. So you kind of went Ontario, West Coast, down back. So now you're in Salmon Arm. What roles have you had? Like, obviously you said you've done field work, all that jazz, but currently you're the strategic forester, I believe, for Forsite. Did I get that right?
Yeah, if I'm working on projects, I call myself a strategic planning forester. I like to work in anything to do with kind of analytics, planning, forest inventory, that kind of thing. But I also have a role within the company. I'm a partner at Forsite, and I manage what we call the Resource Management Technology Group, which is about 60 people spread out across Canada, doing everything. Basically, if you're in the office most of the time, you would be in the group that I manage. And then we also have other groups that are more dedicated to field operations, where they're laying out cut blocks and roads and those kinds of things. So right. I try to spend my time between both working on projects and working on the business, and it kind of keeps me real, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our listeners, maybe introduce us to Forsite, because I believe when I checked on LinkedIn, I don't know if that's the authoritative source, but headcount was 130 for Forsite. So like Forsite's a big entity, obviously, 35 years in the making. So a lot of history there, but maybe for our listeners around the world who may not be as familiar with Forsite, introduce us, how it came to be, and some of the core services that you provide.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. So Forsite was started in like 1987 by John Drew as a small company here in Salmon Arm. And as of right now, we're about 155, 160 people.
Wow.
It depends on summer students. We usually take on 20 or 25 summer students every year, and those guys just headed back. So our numbers just dropped. But we're a good sized company. We're fairly distributed across Canada, with staff all the way from Halifax to Vancouver Island. Most of those are, the big numbers are all in BC. Our roots are in BC, but we've got a presence in quite in almost all the provinces now. We're a full service forest management company. So, the folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis, we're doing, remote sensing, forest inventory, timber supply, GIS analysis. I'd like to think of our group as being, we're here to help you answer questions and make better decisions in your business. And sometimes we actually produce products that go beyond that as well. And then, we have a full suite of field services as well. So yeah, it's a company's grown significantly over time, and that's got a lot to do with the guy who started it, John Drew, is very much, if you have the aptitude, he's willing to let you run with things and build. And that's really what I've been able to do here, which has been a lot of fun.
Right. Very, very cool. Yeah, definitely the great leaders kind of get out of the way or make themselves redundant, get out of the way and let the smart people, as often the leaders say, just do their thing. Is there an interesting story in terms of how you met John and your partner at Forsite? Is there an interesting story how you connected, or it was just a natural progression of your career?
Yeah, it was kind of a natural progression of my career in ways. There's a really dominant force in the type of work I do. This analytical forestry in BC was a guy by the name of Jim Thrower and Jim Associates way back when. That got absorbed into a company called Timberline. But I was looking either going to take a job or take a job here in Salmon Arm, because I was already in Salmon Arm. I came here to work for a much smaller consulting firm initially called Silitech. And I was looking to grow a little broader, and I ended up joining John here with that idea that I could grow something. Whereas if I joined JS Thrower, they were already kind of expertise, and I still consider most of those folks peers and really excellent people to work with. But John's really provided me the opportunity to grab things and grow the business.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we know forestry is a small community, no matter where you are, whether it's coast to coast, per se. So absolutely. So maybe I'm curious to pick your brain in terms of, like, you've been at this for a long time. You're a trained forester, registered professional forester. Over the years, from your point of view, how would you say the landscape has changed from a technology point of view? Because as you mentioned, Forsite provides like full service. The days that we'll talk about lidar, ITC, all the good things our listeners are going to want to learn more about what your capabilities are. But I suspect you've also seen kind of this, I don't know if tidal is the right word, but a tidal change in how things were done back in the day versus how things are done now, and being in the forefront with like boots on the ground. Like, from your point of view, how has that changed? Like, has it surprised you, or is it just been kind of, yeah, we kind of saw this coming from a distance? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that. There's been absolutely colossal change in the industry around technology since during my career. And I started off as a summer student. I actually colored maps with pencil crayons one summer.
Really?
It's that crazy, right? Like the adoption of GIS systems on a whole scale, it came in during my career. And then even something more recent is, well, not that recent, but the addition of lidar to our lexicon in forestry is becoming a complete game changer, where we used to have 20-meter contours, and you really had to go to the field to figure out what's real. You now can get very accurate estimates of what's in the field before you go to the field, and dramatically reduce that field time, improve safety, improve cost outcomes. I mean, it's just been a complete game changer, and that's been a key focus of mine over the last at least 5 years, probably maybe 8 now, is helping companies realize the full value of a lidar investment, because it's not just about making better maps. I mean, I've seen companies acquire lidar, and then they kind of do the same business they've always done with some better data. Like, they make a better contour map and go to the field and do what they've always done, or they use a canopy height model and just continue to do what they're already doing in the field. But changing your business processes is where the cost savings are realized, and helping people leverage it, not just forest inventory or terrain, but we see examples of it from working with First Nations to identify pit houses that elders may or may not have known about. Some did, some didn't.
Okay, cool.
The scope and scale of what is possible when you have highly detailed information on the vegetation and the terrain, the ground underneath. I mean, that's everything in forestry. It's the vegetation and the terrain. So the step change in data quality has completely transformed how you run the business. And I think in every company is in a little bit slightly different place in terms of where they are in that progression of change. There's a great joke about people who do forest inventory. The photo interpreters are very process driven. They draw the polygon, they attribute the polygon. The joke goes, well, how many photo interpreters does it take to change a light bulb, right? And the answer is, the photo interpreter looks back and goes, change. What do you mean change? We don't want change.
Yeah.
So, these well-established processes of how we've done things, like for forest inventory as an example, getting people to start to shift their mentality, it can be some of the biggest challenge. It's not about the tools, the data. It's about getting people to shift their business processes.
Yeah, very, very cool. And so I'm hearing, we already heard lidar, so I'm sensing, lidar is that game changer in the forest industry. You and I have been at this long enough. We kind of knew it a long time ago, but maybe dragging people kicking and screaming, whether they want to be dragged along or not. Do you think, what would you say, how would you describe, because you're mostly operating in Canada with a bit of business in the US, how would you describe the readiness of the landscape? Is BC ahead of maybe Alberta, Ontario, or is it kind of even keel with your regional offices in terms of adoption of lidar? Do you still have to, yes, lidar can measure height, yes, it can measure the ground. Would you say it's kind of caught up across the board, or do you sense there's still more education required across the landscape?
It does vary. In some ways, the companies in BC have had to step forward and do a lot of the lidar. The BC government here is in charge of creating forest inventory. So, when you've got this fractured landscape of who benefits from the acquisition of lidar, in BC, for example, the companies really benefit from it operationally, from a cost savings of how they develop timber, but they weren't getting anything from the forest inventory side because the government pays for that in BC. So, we're in a place like Alberta, where a single entity both pays for the inventory, pays for all the costs, things, can get that return on investment that much quicker. So, when the Alberta government really dove in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, I guess, and they did the whole green zone with low density lidar at that time. Well, that was the best density you could get at that time. So that was a real game changer, and really opened a lot of people's eyes to what was possible. Guys like Murray, you interviewed in Ontario, again, leading the charge. I think we've done the Petawawa Research Forest. He's got about 47 versions of lidar on there. It's a really fantastic illustration of the change of technology over time. But BC feels to me like it's a bit slow to the game on the lidar side, whereas somebody like New Brunswick, where in some cases, if you didn't have as much to start, investing in lidar was a huge step change. BC had invested in, what we call the TRIM program. So if you're already at this level, and then a lidar is going to bring you to here, it's a tougher rationale than if you're down here and you get to go all the way up here in one shot. Something like New Brunswick made a massive change in their forest inventory simply by flying lidar.
Yeah.
So you see these jurisdictions really, I think, ahead of BC now in some cases, simply because of their ability to invest in large programs. Even the Ontario government is now trying to figure out how to work through their lidar program.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you use the word that keyword program, right? And I'd be curious to pick your brain where, early on, a lot of people are so project centric. And then when you bring that temporal component, now they're starting to talk programs, like what's the refresh, revisit frequency? Are you doing 10 years, 5 years, 2 years? But I kind of see that as success. At least the language has changed to program. They know it's not going anywhere versus, a project, it's done. It's like, filed away, but they're kind of signaling these forestry companies and other stakeholders that it's something here to change. Do you think that's the case, that we'll get there? Because part of me, I always joke, when someone flies photo, no one says, Cam, we're flying photo. Like, it's like really it's just like, yeah, we flew photo, right? But when it's lidar, it's like, Cam, we're flying lidar. Like, holy cow, you're flying. Oh my God. Like, it's like this whole thing. I kind of feel like in a couple of years, it's just gonna be like, yeah, I flew lidar. Who cares? It's like I flew photo. It's like I got satellite EO. It's just another tool in your toolkit, per se. But thinking of that, what maybe tell us more about what Forsite has done. So you guys are playing in the lidar space, forest inventory, again, based on who Forsite is and the services. It makes sense. You guys had acquired Object Raku, a lidar ITC company. Maybe walk me through the thinking there, how that came to be, because it's not often a forestry consulting company acquires a technology company. So in some respects, I kind of think on the landscape, I can probably count on my one hand how many times that has happened, and it's not something that happens very often. Maybe can you share like what the thinking there was? Obviously you work with Mike and those guys at Object Raku. I suspect it was a nice synergy, but again, maybe walk us through that thinking and how much push internally you had to, support you had to get to actually get this one through. What share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so when lidar first came in, I mean, internally, just to start embracing lidar, there was a bit of resistance because, I started coming to my partners and say, you know what, if we get good at this lidar stuff, we're going to reduce our costs for our field operations. And most of those guys were, the revenue generation was, boots on the ground time. So we're basically saying, hey, if we get good at this, we're going to reduce your business. So that doesn't, it's not an immediately obvious business strategy, but it's a long-term win for both the client and therefore us in the long term. So just getting everyone's head around what that meant was really interesting. And then as people saw the potential internally, saw the potential for lidar, the inventory side, playing with the canopy height model, doing those kinds of things was somewhat helpful. But then I came across Mike Parlow and Object Raku and their ability to extract tree objects from the lidar point cloud. And that suddenly became very real in terms of a value statement to our clients. We're very connected to our clients all the way from the ground up to these strategic projects. And so that, being able to get tree species specific log products, so basically like a timber cruise, but a census across an entire landscape, was a very powerful concept, and we saw some real business advantage in that. So we began partnering with Object Raku on a number of projects to kind of test it out, feel out what they were all about, just try to prove the technology, because most people are saying, oh, you can do species with lidar. No, you can't do that. That's not possible. And I think that was my initial step as well. So we did a bunch of pilot projects, work with them. Nothing's ever perfect. We can't predict species 100% of the time, but it's certainly better than, or as good or better than any photo interpreter is currently doing. So, and now it's getting to the point where we're starting to improve upon that with, it's more than just lidar. It's bringing in multiple contextual layers, whether it be Sentinel data, wetness indices, slope aspect elevation, all those things that help you predict what tree species might be in a given location. Yeah. So when we saw that potential, working internally with my shareholder group, it ended up being fairly straightforward because we all saw the vision, and it was really more about structuring a deal that was a win-win for both us and the Object Raku guys, because we needed them to be fully bought into the new process. And small tech companies are very entrepreneurial, and we wanted to make sure they felt that we weren't taking that away, that they could come and be part of Forsite and still have that entrepreneurial spirit. And that's the reason I came here, because I felt like I had that option to grow the company. And so merging the two and having Mike Parlow come in, it's worked out, I think, quite well. And they're now kind of what I would call a piece of the puzzle on the inventory side, because my experience as a strategic planner, it's just as much about the operational scale inventory and we need to have the strategic ability to understand, what is a timber supply over time. And when we've got we use a spatial timber supply model called Patchworks. When we schedule stands for harvest into the future, we want to know that when the model schedules that polygon, when we go to the ground there, it's actually real. Right. So, historic polygon inventories, that was a pretty dodgy concept. But now when you can build an operational scale inventory, scale that up or aggregate it to be a strategic product, add things like stand age, and site index and those other attributes that allow you to run a timber supply model, we've not connected the dots across operational strategic, and you get a better sustainable forest management product at a wholesale scale, not just, let's figure out where to put a block.
Right. So we heard patchworks. So in my role moderating, I'm always trying to tease out the technologies that play. So for our listeners, patchworks that play for some of that modeling work. So gotta ask, I've interviewed other experts in lidar and a lot of ABA discussions. A couple other talks coming up more on ITC. I think it's great. You're on the ITC business, but also saying, listen, like we're not 100%, but at the same time, it's not like you're 20% as far as I know. Like it's pretty good. So thinking from that point of view, what would you say the state of the art ITC is? Or maybe I know when your company, Forsite and Lim Geomatics, we had that FP Arctic competition. Accelerated competition. You guys won that. At that point, there was some hybridizing of ITC versus ABA. But maybe for our listeners out there, because as we know, lidar is a hot topic, maybe share with us how you guys tackle things or how you view things. Is it really the delivery of a hybridized EFI? And what you're doing, I think you're delivering on hexagon tessellation as well. But maybe for our listeners who are either already in the space or thinking about getting in this space, maybe share what not the secret sauce, obviously, but what are some of those outputs that you produce and the different flavors so that they can kind of connect the dots, ABA, ITC, or maybe it's both?
Right, for sure. I think the first thing I'll say is whenever we approach an inventory project, it's a bit customized to the client and what they need and the type of forest they're working in. Some forests in Canada just don't have the same kind of value to warrant a very detailed, aka more costly forest inventory process than others. So an example where there's log products and log values are range a fair bit by stand to stand. That's something where an ITC type approach or it would be more warranted. But as a general rule, our approach is one of bottom up. So let's use the ITC approach to get as the best description of the individual trees as you possibly can, knowing that it's not perfect. I'd say we're probably somewhere in the 75% accuracy for individual species.
Cool.
If now caveat on that is if I'm in the Southern Ontario, St. Laurent region with 1 million hardwoods, we're going to be lower than that.
Yeah, we expect that. All the commingling. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
So, but if you're in as a pretty standard project for us, we're in the 75% for accuracy on species. And then, but what the ITC doesn't do particularly well is find all the submerchantable trees that are hiding underneath the bigger ones. We have rewritten our algorithms to find trees in the lower canopies. So it's not just finding treetops and working its way down. It's working in the point cloud to identify tree objects throughout the layers. But the success rate of finding all of the trees in the sub canopy stuff is just not as high as finding the significant trees. We feel quite confident we're finding the vast majority, like 90+% of the big trees that contain the merchantable volume.
Right.
But if you run a cruise on an area and say, okay, what percent of the merchantable trees, and that's anything better than say a 10-centimeter diameter. If it's a highly structured stand, we're probably only finding 50% of the stuff in that lower canopy, and 100% or 90% in the upper canopy. So, we know we don't find all the stems, but we do. It does tend to find almost all the volume because you're finding the big trees, right?
Yep.
So, the ITC is really feeding us a great description of the key volume by species and log product. But as you scale that up into a landscape product, there is bias built into that because there's no plot data that is correcting for that bias. So that's where the hybrid concept comes in. Is if you just want the operational scale inventory that you want to feed cut block metrics, you only need to go as far as the ITC. If you want a product that links to your strategic planning processes, then we need to remove the bias and develop basically a polygon product that you can put in the timber supply model. And where you essentially take the individual trees and you summarize them to tiles or hexagons or whatever, like the standard 400 square meter unit. you can put that, summarize the individual tree data is telling you, and that becomes a predictor of what's actually there. And then you bring in all the ABA metrics as well as additional predictors, and plot data on the ground, and you end up with a final prediction of the best unbiased prediction of what is in that particular unit. And then those can be aggregated to polygons to feed a patchworks model.
Yeah, very, very cool. Very cool. Yeah, so definitely for our listeners, this is probably for some of you the first where you're hearing this hybridized. I think, Cam, you had brought it up way many, well, it's been years now since I've seen you. It's one of those time warp things. It feels like just the other day, but it's like with COVID and everything, it's been a while. But this hybridized concept, very, very, very cool. Are you processing this like in-house, or are you in the cloud, like thinking of the tech stack? Is there anything special? What are your go-to technologies that you're like? Obviously the object Raku algorithms, you guys acquired that company, they're proprietary to you, but are anything special like the usual Esri stack? Are you more open source? I think some of your data science guys are more open source, but is there a special recipe for our digital forester listeners going, hey, I want to dabble with some of this data? Any pro tips on that front?
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely working in the cloud. We use an Amazon cloud system to store and manipulate data. You know, we've written a lot of custom code to process data. You know, our algorithms that segment out trees are, you know, the graphic user interface to speed up those algorithms, not just CPU driven, they're GPU driven. You know, custom code, most of that's written in C, experimentation, and a few other languages. But you know, it's really about machine learning in the cloud using large data sets. It's just, you know, it's not practical to do that kind of stuff. You know, the types of projects we're doing these are operational scale projects that are anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million hectares in size. So you're not doing that on any desktop PCs, that's for sure.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
And in terms of the technology, to be frank, I probably can't answer those questions because I'm not the tech guy. But you know, it's machine learning in the cloud with large data sets for sure.
Yeah, very cool. Yo, absolutely. Well, even hearing that's great because I know talking with different foresters, do you stay on-prem? Do you go to the cloud? Do you do something both? And I think what you're saying at some point with the data volume you're dealing with, it's just not feasible to, well, I guess if you had unlimited dollars, you can do it on-prem, but hope you don't get hacked. But yeah, everyone's going to the cloud there for sure. So thinking about LiDAR, we're talking about that, and it seems like that's a natural progression. I know you guys have developed custom tools and whatnot, but thinking of the technology trends, are you excited about UAV LiDAR, handheld LiDAR? Like all the stuff we're doing is mostly linear mode LiDAR, the old school. I joked when you said, yeah, it was high density back then. It's like you and I will probably have a beer in 10 years and we'll be like, yeah, you remember that ultra super duper low density thing? And we'll be like, oh yeah, you know, the 16 points per square meter, right? Time is going to change. But thinking from that, what is there anything that gets you excited on the LiDAR side, or do you think what we have right now is already good enough? It can only be better going into the future.
Yeah, we could definitely improve on the point density. I think we're quite keen on that. The drone stuff that we've been working with lately, you know, instead of having to find, you know, tree objects in the point cloud that our current algorithms work on, our algorithm uses multiple ways to find trees, but the one that it can be relied on even more going forward is actually finding the bole, that linear bole of the tree. I know you guys did some work on that as well. So, you know, that with high density LiDAR, that becomes much more possible. And in particular for deciduous trees, working from the ground up from a stump is to get stems is a far more reliable way than trying to come from a crown down. So, you know, high density LiDAR, the drone stuff we've been playing with it looks really promising. The key to doing big areas though is it has to be consistent. Like if you've got really varying LiDAR, you know, the overlap changes, the point density changes, those can prove pretty challenging when you move to, you know, things like individual tree extractions. So it's about controlling the quality of that LiDAR collect, and we work with 3 or 4 providers currently to do that in an airborne style. You know, our work with helicopter collections in the past were always quite challenging because you have a helicopter that change the pitch and the yaw just very slightly. It just focuses that beam for a millisecond longer in one place and less in another. you don't get very consistent point clouds. So the fixed wing stuff has been significantly better for us. And I think we're going to face some of those same challenges with UAVs. If they're buffeted by wind, or the operators aren't particularly, adept at maintaining consistent quality, these object extraction processes become more challenging.
Right. Well, what's interesting, you mentioned you're partnering with different image providers, because even with the move and acquiring Object Raku, there's other forestry consulting firms we know that maybe didn't go that route. They went more the acquisition route and then kind of got sucked into, oh, and I'm now a mapping company versus, a forestry company. So it's kind of interesting, because I was curious to see at what point does Forsite buy their own lidar sensor, because then you can control all those parameters, and then you can fly to Corner Brook, you can fly to whenever you want without asking anyone. Just say you got a job and off you go.
Sure. Yeah, I can't see us getting into acquisition, to be honest. We're really keen to work with business partners on that. The capital intensive nature of that, the changing necessity. There are folks that are just really good at managing that type of the business, and we developed some really great relationships with these folks. So when a client comes to us for an inventory project, we have, we'll put out quotes to 2 or 3 of these folks just to make sure that we're getting competitive prices. But we know each one of these select providers will provide us what we need, and we've worked with them long enough to get there. And I just can't see us going there to get into that kind of business.
Yeah, for sure. This is where we start wagering, right? Like throw the $20 down and go, let's see what happens, type of thing. So I know you guys have built a lot of really cool tools, software tools to leverage the lidar beyond the EFI. Maybe share with some of our listeners what some of them are. I know you guys have what's it called? It's a deflection line tool for cable harvesting. There's some culvert work. There's some block analytics, but maybe for our listeners who may be interested in following up and learning more about Forsite and its capabilities, maybe walk us through some of those cool, and of course, I believe they're on your website as well, but it's fun to hear it firsthand what some of those cool tools are.
For sure. Yeah, again, so it's this ability to, how do we help our clients leverage the full value from a lidar data set? And when you're pre-planning in the office, cut blocks and roads to reduce the amount of field time, which can be quite expensive, having tools at your fingertips to help you get quick answers is really powerful. So initially, Western Forest Products on Vancouver Island and BC Coast approached us to develop tools, and we developed them for them. So they technically own the IP in it, but we've developed a relationship with them where we're able to also sell those tools to other folks as well. As it's kind of a bit of a partnership between us and Western Forest Products. Partnership not in a legal sense, but in a joint project kind of thing. So what the tool is it's really it's an add-on within the ArcGIS environment. And right now it's an ArcMap, and we're currently programming an ArcPro version. But what it does is if you have a DEM sitting in the background or an individual tree inventory, you don't have to have them drawing, but as you're planning your block, you can simply, draw a road, and it'll give you immediate feedback on the grade lines you're running. You can draw a deflection line, describe the cable yarding setup that you have, and it'll determine percent deflection on any given area. Things like stream profiles to understand whether it's a fish-bearing stream or a non-fish-bearing stream. And then there's the forest inventory summary. So you can draw a block boundary, hit a button, and you basically get a table that comes back that looks a lot like a timber cruise, because it's running on the individual tree inventory, like species and log products and so on. So we continue to evolve and build new tools as clients tell us what's valuable to them, and as our own planning foresters saying, hey, why doesn't it do this? Why can't we have that? So our connection into the operational world helps make sure that the product makes sense.
Yeah, very, very, very cool. So Team Forsite is expanding, I think even on your website, at 10 locations across Canada. So, that's super cool. What's driving that growth? Is this purely a strategic play? Is it really the investment? You mentioned earlier in the pod, the vision, there's a strategy being executed. Do you feel like the industry as a whole is validating that strategy and that's fueling the growth? Or is this just part of that overall, doing great work, foresters being foresters, recognize that and reward those who do good work? And that's part of the journey. Because when you look at it, a map, it's almost like the Forsite wall is marching eastwards, right? And I know you've hired a couple people from the East Coast, even Ontario, there to add to Craig's work in Ontario there. But is there anything you can share in terms of, what's the what's the tactical or strategic move heading eastward? Are we going south as well? Are we going global plans for Forsite?
I think what I can say is that our growth is pretty much organic. So where we see opportunity and we find good people, we connect the dots. So we're very rarely would we be putting in any kind of investment for strategic growth. We're really a people-based business, and if you find the right people and you hire them, and clients find good people, and it really is. When we focus on finding and maintaining and keeping people happy in the business and providing the structure around them to let them be successful, we continue to grow. And at some point, maybe we'll get to a point where growing doesn't make sense anymore. We want to focus on where we're at. But to date, the demand continues to increase. We keep finding good people to add to the team, and the diversity is really useful. I mean, the pandemic was quite interesting in the sense that it really forced people into this video conferencing world. So it really didn't matter where you were. So, that very quickly let me hire, I have 4 people in Fredericton and Halifax now that I don't think we would have had those folks there, at least not doing the same type of work without the pandemic, because of the push to put all of our clients into a more virtual environment. So,
yeah.
People are, there's 4 people in the Maritimes, but we don't do a lot of work in the Maritimes. The forestry consulting environment out there is quite different than elsewhere, and there's some opportunity, but it's just not the same as in Western Canada. But there is a lot of opportunity in Ontario, and we continue to see. I think you can expect to continue to see growth in Ontario for sure.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the province moving forward with their SPL. Single photon lidar work. I guess I should remember. We should explain our jargon for the listeners who are like, what are these 2 guys talking about? But yeah, with the SPL moving forward. So yeah, that's cool to hear in terms of that organic growth, focusing on people. For foresters, I agree. It's like you're out in the woods, and nowadays, truthfully, you can do your Zoom or team calls from the woods as long as you got a couple bars, right? So as a forester, it's kind of a dream job from that point of view. So thinking forward, climate change is obviously in the forefront. There's the UN report there, Code Red. And BC fires? You're out there. My sister-in-law is out in Peachland, and showing photos where it's just like orange, and you're like, holy crap, like that's not that far. And they're like, no, it's kind of turning this way, and you see 5 bombers going down to pick up water. So it's kind of crazy. But and I think there's once we spoke, your daughter's a forest firefighter as well, which I'm not sure I'd ever let my daughter, one of my 3 daughters, do that. But hey, I'll have to take tips from you. But forestry, what are your thoughts on its role in climate change? Is this one of those we always knew as foresters, start listening to what forestry is about? It's not about just cutting trees down. There's more to it. But what are your thoughts seeing these recent actual events in your backyard versus these reports that are really trying to escalate the language further? What role do you see forestry playing in that?
Well, it's going to be significant. I'm just wrapping up a report for Canadian Council of Forest Ministers on how forests can play a role in mitigating climate change. And nature-based solutions are going to be a significant part of any solution going forward. Something as simple as the 2 billion tree commitment that the federal government has put forward. That's very much a long-term strategy. If you put a tree in the ground today, it's not really going to help us for at least 20 years by the time it's accumulating any kind of carbon. But there are a lot of things we can do with our forests to help remove CO2 from the atmosphere and avoid emitting new CO2. I mean, because of the renewal, I could go on this for a while, so just shut me off whenever you want. Forestry is a renewable resource. We can create a lot of products from it. There's a huge focus right now on replacing concrete and steel with wood products, mass timber and those types of products. Architects who are trying to get LEED certified buildings are building with wood, and wherever they can, replacing concrete and steel, just because of the lowered embodied carbon that comes with wood. You're storing carbon, and it's a renewable resource. So, forests are going to continue to be a major driver in the climate change world. And out here in the West, as you mentioned, fire is a huge impact on that. We sequester this CO2 out of the atmosphere, but then we release massive amounts of it during these large scale wildfires. So part of that is about having active management of forests, where you try to let a forest just leave it on the shelf and just it'll be there forever. That's probably not going to be the best strategy. You're going to have some kind of active management. You're going to have good inventories of those forests to provide that management. I mean, I don't want to make it sound simple. It's not just it's about reintroducing fire. It's about how we manage the forest. But I think there's now going to be a lot more focus on making sure that we do think about how we manage the forest in light of climate change and the risks associated with fire. But I'm really excited by the whole thing. I love this interplay of the analytics of carbon sequestration, forest management, forest inventory, understanding what's out there and what can be.
Yeah, very cool. Well, part of me is always curious to see after all with universities whether there's an uptake in students entering forestry because they start educating themselves and realizing it's not about making toilet paper or cardboard. There's so much more to it. So curiosity, does your daughter still firefight? Do you have a heart attack every single day when the fires are going and I don't know if she's one of those ones who jumps out of the airplane or something, but I'm just like, new respect for you. I'm like, I don't know how you sleep at night. If that was my daughter, I'd be losing my mind.
I don't know, maybe I'm too calm, but I have a lot of faith in her, and she's a very smart and well-trained individual. BC Wildfire has never had a fatality in their history. They're a very well-run, well-trained organization. She does actually work for an organization called RapAttack, which means they work on quite small fires. They'll come in by helicopter, rappel down with ropes into the location, put out fires that are kind of less than hectare in size. Stop them from getting big while you still have the chance type thing. And she's passionate about it. She loves it. I mean, most people who are working in that industry are really passionate about it, and I get a lot of joy from watching her do it, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, at times I wonder is growing up seeing dad, the analytics forester, doing this stuff, and I'm going to go the other way and jump out of helicopters and save fires. Very cool. So maybe if I bring us back to the technology front, what gets you excited? 1, 3, 10-year horizon as we start winding down. What gets you excited from the technology point of view as a forester?
I think it's the ever increasing amount of data and good quality data on our operations in the forests themselves, and the opportunities to connect all of that. I mean, you guys are doing some neat work in those types of areas. So, when a harvester head cuts down a tree, we're tracking that tree has fallen, and we can track it through a supply chain and understanding, making those connections, optimizing haul cycles. There's just so much opportunity to improve what we do in the forest. A bit of a sidebar, like when I went into forestry, very few people came in who were, I readily call myself a geek. I mean, I like to play outside, but I started learning how to program a Commodore 64 when I was a kid.
Me too. It's dating us, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. But this combination of I love being outside and I love being this kind of leveraging data thing. And I think we're finally starting to see a few more people head into forestry with that kind of a vision. I was a pretty rare breed back then. I mean, a bit of a weirdo going into forestry, wanting to do math and engineering and, write code, that kind of thing. And, that's becoming a lot more common now, and it's easier for us to find people to hire that understand forestry concepts and understand some of the technology as well. So that's a good thing, and I'm looking forward to just that, leveraging that capacity of the human brain, because the pool who did that in the forestry world in the past was not particularly big. Most people went into forestry because they wanted to walk around in the bush, not sit behind a computer. Now we're getting a bit more of the mix.
Yeah, for sure. So thinking out 10 years, if I bring you out there, what's the digital forester toolkit look like from Cam Brown's seat?
Wow, not sure I have a good answer to that one, but I think it's definitely one of less boots on the ground time. You're always going to have to go to the ground to confirm and address certain issues, but I think there's going to be almost a virtual world that you'll be able to represent in the office to do the planning and analysis work. I think we'll have a much better handle on what sustainable rates of harvest are. Our current estimates of what's out there in the forest and how quickly we can cut it. We've got good information on that, but we can continue to increase that significantly. And then from an operations point of view, I think we're just going to know where every stick is at every time, and the sequencing of equipment will be significantly refined from where it is today.
Yeah, very cool. I love that, knowing where each stick is at every point in time, for sure. So as we look to wind down together, thinking of our listeners, we've got full range for people who aren't doing anything. We can look south. As you know, there's different landscape, of course, but and even when we look globally, like everyone's at different stages per se. For thinking of foresters who just want to get into this and try different things, what are maybe 3 pro tips based on looking back with your experiences dealing with the lidar data and the modeling and the relationship building? Are there any pro tips you'd give that young or old forester looking to dabble, in terms of, don't worry about the volume of data, don't worry about the tools, focus on this? Any pro tech tips you'd give to our foresters?
That could go all over the place, I guess, but from a forester, I would tell them to go spend some time in the field first, for sure. Make sure you're staying up to date on technology, but go spend some time in the field to make sure that what you're doing in the office has some real tangible validity to it. Once you get in the office, the amount of open source software tools is phenomenal. Like even while you're in school, being able to pull some of the free segmentation algorithms that are out there, the R programs that have been made available by folks like you may. There's so much stuff that you can begin to explore, and just don't be afraid to try stuff. The people I love to hire are the folks that have already tried this stuff just for fun, just to see what they could do, what's possible. I think always ask yourself what might be possible here. Let's give it a try, and go from there. But grounded in a reality of understanding what forestry is all about.
Right. That's a great way to summarize it. Try different things, experiment, but don't lose. Don't forget about there's trees out there at the end of the day, and tying it back to reality. So very cool. Cam, anything else you wanted to share with us? Anything topic? We've gone through quite a few topics there, but a chance for you. Is there anything you're itching to share? Any breaking news, hot off the press news, or anything on your side?
No, I don't think I have anything. You've covered it pretty thoroughly, Kevin. It's been a great chat. I appreciate it.
Cool, very cool. So for our listeners who want to get a hold of you, Forsite, to talk about new opportunities or projects or R&D or services, what's the best way of reaching you? Email, LinkedIn, Twitter, website? What's the best way?
Yeah, if you go to forsite.ca, my contact information is on there. Just drop me a line by email or reach out by phone, whatever works for you, and happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, Cam, thanks so much for joining. This is a talk I've been looking forward to. As I said, I haven't seen you in years. Actually, I don't even know the last time. Maybe it was up in Northern Ontario. I don't even know now. It's kind of becoming this blur, everything, dates per se. But thanks so much for making the time to chat. I'm sure our listeners are going to hear tidbits and get excited about some of the things they heard and hopefully follow up with you. But thanks so much for making the time. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Cheers. Thanks, Kevin.